Hey everyone, welcome to Old World Legends, where we focus on building the community. I'm your host Mike, and with me as always is Evan.
Dragon over Shaggoth Evan.
That's a fancy title, much fancier than mine. But anyway, we're not here to talk about titles today. We're here to talk about a topic that we love chatting about all the time amongst ourselves and amongst the community: is the value of victory points, or perhaps not the value. What are they doing for the game? Are
Mm-hmm.
they helping Warhammer: The Old World? Are they hurting it? How is this shaping the event scene, the competitive scene? Certainly, this impacts some players who are playing at the top meta in a very different way than, let's say, the casual player, who it might not affect them as much. So, Evan, why don't we start with take us through kind of the fundamentals of victory points? How does it basically work from the core rulebook?
Okay, so what's interesting is that victory points are broken down on just half of one page, but I think they're one of the most valuable part of the rules because
Yeah.
unlike something like the detachment rules, which take up about as much text as well, they affect every single game and they affect who wins and who loses. And then what it says here is that first of all, you only need to win by 100 victory points more than your opponent to say you're the winner. And in this book, there's only a winner and a loser, otherwise a draw. There is no like scoring system like we have in an event where there'd be some number of points to determine how much you won by. It's very binary, and then it
True.
breaks
But
down.
that being said, of course,
Yeah,
at our events, or pretty much all events, the win is always worth more than the loss, certainly in the pairings bracket
sure.
and the podium placement. So definitely there's less nuance. I mean, certainly how many victory points are your delta relative to the event you go to will vary. But right, if I go 5-0 in an event and you go 4-1, it doesn't matter at any event if you score a crap ton more victory points. The 5-0 player at every event I know of is still going to get top placing in that scenario we just described. So it is
Right.
interesting that only 100 points, 100 points also relative to 2,000 points, right? If you're in a 500 versus 500 point game, 100 points is a lot, but our average game that the community is playing is 2,000 versus 2,000 points. 100 points is very easy to achieve in a 2,000 versus 2,000 point game.
Right. So it's 5% of your total.
It's not a
That's
lot, is it?
tiny. That's like a rounding error, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So should this scale off of how large the army is? I'm not sure. I think that the main thing we'll go into here is that there's a lot of times where you get no points. And you're like,
Yeah.
what do you mean I got no points? I spent all game battering that unit of Graveguard to death. They kept coming back, but I mean, I killed so many of them. What do you mean I get no points for that at all? It's like, well, why don't you read what the rules say? So, first, dead or fled, you get victory points for basically destroying a unit all the way. So, it's either totally destroyed or fled off the battlefield. That's worth 100% of its
Mm-hmm.
points cost, right? Or if it's fleeing but it hasn't been run down or anything at the end of the game, that's worth 50%, right? Or here's the kicker, right? If it's reduced to less than 25% of its unit strength, it's worth only 25% of its cost, which is almost nothing. So if there's a unit of 80 Graveguard, or more reasonable, let's say there's 30 Graveguard, and you get them down to 4 left, you get 100 victory points for that. Something like that. Because that's
Yeah.
400 point unit is now down, you only get 25% for killing 75% of the unit,
So
right?
people who aren't as familiar with the system, we know definitely a lot of our listeners are avid gamers and are playing all the time. But for those of you who aren't as familiar, right, the way it
Mm-hmm.
works is we play a game. We play our typically the 6 rounds, and at the end of the game, we tally up, hey, who won the game? And every game of Warhammer: The Old World by default uses the victory point system, right? We're not talking about objective missions or other new creative things that maybe events or TOs are running, but the default rules are it's victory points. And so you only need 100 points to win by. And the default is, hey, if I have a unit that's worth 100 points and Evan kills it, then he would get 100 victory points, right?
Right.
That's kind of the base out of the box, very simple. But now you start getting into all these nuances. Well, Evan didn't kill the entirety of my unit. He only killed half the unit or a quarter of the unit, right? And
Yeah.
suddenly you start seeing that the way that the designers have written the rule, they've really skewed it so that you really need to or are encouraged to wipe out the enemy unit to the very last model. But that actually is kind of hard to do. And
Yeah.
this actually creates some interesting behavior. It certainly does encourage you to wipe a unit out, but it also can have some adverse effects. But let's keep going through this example. So in
Sure.
this example of the Graveguard unit, right? Hey, you wiped out. I killed 75% of that unit, right? I should score, you would think, 75% of its points. But that's not what the rule says,
Hmm.
does it, Evan?
No. So it's only 25%, which even for a unit of, let's say, 435 points of Graveguard, that's only going to be like 110 points of victory
Yeah.
points, right? And meanwhile, how many of your units died on the way?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's only really two other things here that aren't basically situational. There's the king is dead, so if the general is killed or fled off the table or is fleeing, you get 100 victory points. Um, and then you win a bonus 50 victory points for each standard claimed as a trophy, and the battle standard is worth another 50.
Mm-hmm.
So this is it. That's how you get the points. And so what does this mean? Well, every army has to have a general, so everyone has this basically that you can
Mm-hmm.
potentially get. But
Yep.
units being dead or fled and having trophies or having banners, these are optional. And so, what if somebody brings a unit that's completely unkillable and doesn't have any banners anywhere? The army you're up against could have no points that are easy to get, right?
Yeah, it's definitely and that's one that's really interesting because the banner points, if you will, trophies of war. That's about getting enemy standards. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
I took a unit, I paid the points to upgrade it for a standard, and you find that this will fluctuate greatly based upon the army that you're playing against and also the meta that you're playing in, and the rules. As an example, some armies, let's take an example such as the undead. Well, the banners don't give them much of a purpose because they're immune to psychology, so they're not going to flee. Unless they want it upgraded to a magic standard, generally speaking, they're not encouraged to take standards, right? So suddenly, well, I might not take any standards in my army, or maybe just one. So those are points that I'm not giving up to Evan for wiping out my units versus
Yeah,
some other armies, typically armies that are low leadership. They would want to take a lot of standards to help them with combat resolution or things of that such. But that's also typically something you're going to see often in big bricks of infantry that you want to have staying around where combat resolution matters, right? But if you're playing an MSU army, right, multiple small units, well, you're not trying to stick around, and combat resolution is not something that you're thinking about. So there's all these factors that relative to the army, it could be pretty skewed. You could playing against an opponent who happens to have a ton of standards and they're giving up all these extra points versus an opponent who has close to no standards and none. But I think what we're seeing most commonly in the meta right now is very few standards in general.
yeah,
Often when we see them, it's either the battle standard bearer because they really want those rerolls, but more often than not, they're in the one or two units, a Death Star unit, because they're taking a magic standard. That's typically often when we see it because inherently right now the way the game is balanced, we're not seeing a lot of those tons of rank and file infantry bricks that they have a really strong incentive to take a standard. That just doesn't exist in the game right now. We have seen it that way in the past in previous editions, and I bet you we're going to see that in the future. But right now, that's not how it's playing out, is it?
yeah. No, and I think that the seeing the different banners on the table is something that everyone really likes to see. And so, in particular,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a bunch of little squads that don't have any banners in them at all because they're trying to avoid giving up points because they're running MSU, or
Yeah.
having one massive brick that's so big and it's the only banner you see on the whole table because it's a unit of like 40 Graveguard. That's another thing that's kind of skewing the other way, where it's just a Death Star of points now because how are you going to kill this one unit, right?
Very
So,
hard.
yeah. So these are essentially the symptoms of this specific way to score the points. Now, I think, Mike, you were saying when we were talking about this before that one of the reasons they might want to do this is it's easier to calculate at the end of the game just which units got killed. Okay, we'll figure out those ones. And for the most part, it's just whether or not they were totally wiped out. That'll be the points you get. It would be a lot harder, for example, to count up every individual model that was removed and find all of its individual points per each model that got removed and then add all of those up, right? That would be
Yeah,
much
I
more
mean,
difficult.
let's call a spade a spade. Human error is a real thing,
Yeah.
and I don't think war gamers are known for being the best mathematicians out there. There's a reason why we like to use apps to calculate the army points for us, and Again, right? It's just it's a deep game, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of aspects to it and upgrades, and we love those crunchy aspects and that customization you get with making your army. But it does tend lend itself towards human error, and these things happen. So certainly, when the designers were creating these rules or the latest version of these rules, I think they're really taking in two factors into consideration. First and foremost is they're just trying to make it more accessible, right? Avoid the human error where possible, and by simplifying this to rather than count up every individual model, which would be a more accurate representation of what you killed, they just have these brackets, and these brackets, while you still have to do some math, what is 25% of this unit, and let's face it, half the people out there are probably still going to get that question wrong, because rarely does it actually break down to an even number. So that's still something that will happen, but happen less often. There's
Yeah.
less error, and it's faster. Is it super fast? No, but it's much faster than counting up individual models, especially because, let's face it, at the end of the game, where's the dead over here and what's left alive? And people kind of just put their models all over the table when they're removing their casualties, and it gets a little messy
Yeah.
because you're focused on the moment to moment. So that's one factor, accessibility. But I think the other factor that's in here is I do believe the designers were trying to incentivize players to be have more engagement. They're trying to incentivize, hey, don't just bloody a unit and have it back away. They want you as the aggressor to go finish killing a unit. I do believe that is one of the intentions they have here, because they've not just made it simplified. We talked about it a second ago. They've skewed the point system. It's not I killed half of your unit, Evan. Hey, I get half its points. That would just mean they've just streamlined it 75%, 50%, 20%. No, they're actually saying if I kill your 75% of your unit, I still only get 25% of the points. So to get that additional 75%, I have to wipe out that unit.
Yeah.
Not get it down to two models or one model, but wipe it out. So
Yeah.
these rules are intentionally designed to get you to complete finishing units. And that is not a bad thing inherently. It's good to encourage aggressive attack or engaging the enemy rather than the opposite. But it also, we've seen, can create aberrant behavior,
Right.
right? In terms of what do I mean by aberrant behavior? I mean, this is behavior that I do not believe the designers of this game intended for players to behave this way. It's aberrant. They intended for more interaction, but actually what we see is with some top tables, we could see less interaction, Evan, can't we?
Yeah. So one of the things you can do is say, "Oh, you're going to charge me, and you're probably just going to kill my unit if you make it. I'm just going to flee." And so you might
Mm-hmm.
just flee from every charge because what's the worst that could happen? You could be fleeing at the end of the game. That's worth only half as much as if you got killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
That's right.
some armies that, let's say you're playing against dwarves and they're just walking towards you at movement 3 and they're like, "I'm going to charge you now," and you're like, "Well, the smart thing for me to do is to just flee from you every single time
Mm-hmm.
because why not,
Yeah.
right?" And there's a few other things that happen almost every game. Is okay. So I have I have a general like my half prince on a dragon. He's gonna have 9 wounds total. If he has 1 wound left at the end of the game, how many points is he worth? Zero.
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 Big stinking zero. That's a whole bunch of feel bad right there.
Well, it certainly makes the other person feel like, well, why don't I even try to fight him? So I'm going to fight everything but him, and that's not
Mm-hmm.
engagement, right? That's not we're not engaging with each other. You're saying I can't engage with you. I'm going to go do something else, right? That's not, we're not playing. I'm doing something and you're ignoring me, right?
Yeah.
So some of these rules and the way that they get played lead to less engagement, whether by
Yeah.
just running away or by having it be so hard to get points from either a large brick of like we keep talking about the 40 Graveguard, or just a prince on a dragon who's what if he only had 1 wound left at the end? You still get nothing.
Yeah.
I've
Or
ended a couple games with just 1 wound left on my dragon lord and given up no
yeah.
points.
Or even again, not the end of the game. Let's say that
Yeah,
Dragon Lord gets to one wound on turn three, right? Early
yeah.
in the game, because something shot it. Oh, cool.
Oh my,
I'm gonna go take my Dragon Lord. I'm gonna go park him over here in the
yeah,
corner of the board behind this terrain where I'm faster than you. I'm hidden. You'll never catch me the rest of the game. I'm just going to literally avoid you to conserve those points. And that is part of the strategy of the game. But again, I do not believe that was designers' intent. I believe
yeah,
this is where there are positive incentives in terms of there are encouraging some more interaction by complete killing unit. But because the victory point rules in their current form are very shallow in terms of their depth, right? That, and also because of the incentivization system, I believe they're creating, once players really learn the system and they really learn the rules, they're actually going to game the system, play the game the way the rules are written, and they're going to create less interaction, which is unfortunate. I think this is why, and we'll talk about this in future episodes, why we see more events both altering or updating the victory point scoring system, such as at our Old World Legends events. We asked the community, I think last year, and implemented it so that you do score points for killing enemy monster characters, right? If you get them down to 50% or 25%, we give you part of their victory
Yeah.
points. That's something we do at our events, which our community asked for and has been very popular. But we're also starting to see a new trend. Now, we're not going to deep dive into it here right now, but Evan, what's the trend we're starting to see in 2025?
So I think people are ready and willing to start adopting the idea that maybe the scenarios should have more objectives. Basically, places where if I capture the center of the board, I should get 100 victory points per round or something, so that
Mm-hmm,
there is a neutral place that's equidistant to both players where you have to actually be sitting on it to earn some points. And
mm-hmm.
if that's, whether it's like, for example, in the Lonely Tower mission that's in the main book, or in the latest release that Games Workshop released for the High Elf versus Chaos missions, there's
Yeah.
some kind of objective point that somebody has to sit on to then give you points. And so, what does this do? Why is this potentially better? Well, it's a separate system than these kill points, and it requires you to hold a specific piece of ground, and if you flee or if you are running and hiding behind a building, you're not scoring that objective because you're off by yourself, right? I think
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
in my last game at the GT, it was ogres versus ogres, and Mike, how many wounds does an ogre tyrant on a stonehorn have?
Oh my
Or
God, it's
thunder
so
tusk?
many. Is it more than 10?
No, no, it's not as many as you might think. It's 9 wounds, the same as like an elf lord on
Okay.
a dragon. Even though
That's
the
still a lot of
sure,
wounds.
sure. How many wounds can an iron blaster do in one shot?
I don't know. How
It's
many wounds
D3
can an
plus
Iron
1, so the
Blaster?
max is 4.
Okay.
And what happens if 2 iron blasters shoot your ogre tyrant on thunder tusk in the first round?
Well, you're not going to be happy, that's for sure, assuming he max rolls it. But the important thing is you're not going to be dead, right?
Well, yeah. So I had tyrant on thunder tusk, okay, and got hit with the first iron blaster, 4 wounds. Hit with the second
Ooh.
iron blaster, 4 more wounds. So
Oh.
my ogre on a tyrant on thunder tusk has 1 wound left
Mm-hmm.
on at the end
Uh,
of turn 1.
and how many points was that character, right?
450 something.
So yeah, close to 500 points. That's a lot of points in a
Plus he's the
2,000 point
general, so
game.
that's another 100 if he. So it's a 6. So 550 if he dies,
Yeah,
right?
that's a huge point differential.
And
Mm-hmm.
how many games do you know of where somebody wins by less than that much, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking is,
Mm-hmm.
oh God, I need to just go run my general, who's giving my leadership to the rest of the army, go and hide him behind a
Mm-hmm.
building for the rest of the game because
And
otherwise
he's
I'll
often
lose.
your coolest character too. You want
Yeah,
him to get into battle, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So
And
it
so
is interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so there are other ways to potentially incentivize people to interact. So one way, like we said, if there's some kind of objective where sitting on it might be more valuable than hiding, right? Then running away and hiding is less interesting. It's more interesting to go to a physical location where, hey, guess what? We can then fight each other, right? And
Yeah.
something else we see in the game happen quite a lot right now is that cavalry often beats infantry because it can charge farther. Well, guess
Mm-hmm.
what? If you put the cavalry on the objective in the middle of the board, now what if that might not leave you with the exact right number of inches away from some unit to be able to
Yeah.
beat it in the charge? Now you're in a
Well,
different
let's not
position.
do too deep of a
Yeah,
dive, Evan. We're going to do a whole separate episode to talk about objective-based missions. But I think the point is here,
yeah.
there's some really exciting opportunities here, and we actually tried last year with our community to bring out the objectives because, again, this is not an old world specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
Other tabletop games have started just where old world is right now in terms of it was killing based systems primarily or only, right? And then over time, they almost all of them eventually shift towards objective based missions. Now there's a spectrum there, right? There's a version where it's a hybrid where you get more points for holding the objectives, and then eventually the system becomes so skewed that you can only win or lose by holding the objectives, right? There's many different variations to that, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot of different creativity and ingenuity. But I think the main thing is we didn't see our SoCal community really ready for that last year because people were still building their armies, getting familiar with the rules, right,
Right.
ramping up to things. But we're definitely seeing, as we start seeing more and more of the same individuals attending the events, they're starting to ask and get ready for, hey, I love this game, it's so much fun, but I know in a straight up fight, victory point versus victory point, it's going to be very hard, almost impossible for me to win these situations. I would love some variety here. I'd love for more variation, and people always love to see that, right? Mixing up the
Yeah.
meta, changing
Yeah.
things up. I think that's a big reason why we don't just keep repeating the same missions and scenarios at our events. We keep changing it up, and people love that. It keeps it fresh, it keeps it exciting. So I
Right.
think we're going to see more of that in the future.
And just one more thing to point out is that victory points from killing units means every unit's points value is simultaneously how hard it is to get into your list, but also how valuable it is for the other person to beat. So if a unit is
Mm-hmm.
very underpriced, it's not only doing more for the enemy on the budget, but it's also worth less when you defeat it, right?
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
gigantic chaos spawn is insane at its output for its points, but then if you kill it, it's like the cost of a unit of like 6 Dark Elf Cold One riders, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, it's
And
not a
so,
ton.
which one of
Yeah.
those two things is easier to get rid of?
Yeah. The
Um,
Cold Riders, for
yeah,
sure. Not even close.
right. And then so then if you have a unit that costs too many points, right? Like let's say Dwarf Slayers. Well, now if you bring this unit to the game, not only do you have less stuff that is reaching out and touching your opponent, you're also carrying around this giant goodie bag for them to go hit and then points come out like a pinata.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point you're making there, Evan. That effectively, because while we continue to play Old World as a
Yeah,
victory points only system, or even primary system, effectively the points cost of a unit is not just how efficient it is at killing things, which is critical to the game, its output, but also how effective it is points denial,
yeah,
or how few points it gives up. And again, there are some people who are like, hey, points denial list is a really fun list and a fun way to play, and there definitely are. We saw that in one of the Dwarf Arcane journals. They specifically created units to around a potential build or theorizing of not giving up victory points upon their death. But effectively, what Evan's pointing out is that because of the system, the points cost of a unit is doubling down on whether you should take it or not, because not just because of its output efficiency, but its denial efficiency
right.
is very critical. And sometimes that can be a lot of fun. But again, I think for us and what we love to see out of Old World is more engagement with both players. And while points denial can be a valid strategy, and it absolutely is, it also discourages interaction. The reality is it's not so much fun for the other opponent if they're not ever scoring any points, or it's almost impossible to get points off of you because of Death Stars. Some meta lists, that's actually some of the best way to play. But at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, right? And for us, it's more important that everybody's having fun, right? That's what we're trying to go here. It's fine winning your games too, but
Yeah,
again, we believe this is why we're starting to see the shift further away from the victory point in events and more the community asking for those objective based, because we believe this will lead towards more fun for everybody involved. It will shake up the meta and potentially see a lot more of those infantry bricks that people would love to see come back to the field. Now, again, it's not a catch-all be all that will solve all problems of the game. It's an ever evolving system, and we're excited to see what the future brings. Uh,
yeah. I mean, I think
Evan,
that
yeah.
very minor errata changes that they release in their FAQ errata massively change the game. I think that that one line that said that every single model in the unit gets to see and shoot at a large target led us
Mm-hmm.
to Death Star of poison archers. Like
Yep.
that's single errata. So I think that it can often be an incredibly subtle thing. Like this one line about 25%, less than 25%, you get 20% of the points. I think in many other editions, it was if they're under 50%, you would get 25% of the points or something like that.
There's
Like
been a few versions of
yeah.
it. Yeah.
For example, this third one here. This means that any single model unit never gives up its points unless if it's killed all the way. It means that any unit that's less than 4 models can never give up its points unless if it's killed all the way, right? So if you take
Yep.
3 Dragon Ogres, you have to kill all 3 of them or else you get nothing. So
Yep.
the fact that it says less than 25% here is massive. And if it said less than 50, I think the game would be very, very different.
Yep. And you let us know whether you think that's good or bad for the game. So, why don't we wrap this one up? And again, as always, thank you for listening. Hopefully, you got it this far in the video. And please do like, share, and subscribe. Helps us reach other people. Evan, any last thoughts?
Of course, they gotta stay legendary.
All right. We'll catch you next time. Bye.